This isn't some story I made up for views. This is my life, what happened to me, and I'm telling it now because I need people to know that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one you should be most afraid of. The bone china plate was cold against my fingertips, a stark contrast to the stifling warmth of the Sterling family's formal dining room in Greenwich, Connecticut. My ex-husband, Jonathan, stood at the head of the 20-foot mahogany table and raised his crystal glass of champagne, a predatory smile playing on his lips. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept over his assembled family, deliberately skipping over me, seated halfway down like a forgotten piece of furniture. "A toast," he announced, his voice smooth as polished marble, "to new beginnings." His gaze landed on a vapidly smiling blonde seated to his right, her hand, adorned with a diamond the size of a quail's egg, resting proprietorially on his arm. "And to my fiancée, Tiffany." The words were a gunshot in the quiet room, the laughter and murmurs of the Sterling clan the ringing in my ears that followed. My divorce had only been finalized for 3 weeks. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. My invitation to this Thanksgiving had been a command performance delivered by my former mother-in-law, Eleanor. "For appearances, Amelia," she'd purred over the phone. "We wouldn't want people to think this divorce was anything but amicable." Amicable, the word was a joke. Jonathan had left me with a mountain of debt he'd secretly accrued in my name and a divorce settlement that wouldn't cover 3 months' rent on my new shoebox-sized apartment in Brooklyn. He had taken everything, my home, my financial security, the career in journalism I had so willingly sacrificed for his burgeoning political aspirations, and the last 10 years of my life. Now, surrounded by the oil paintings of his ancestors, he was taking my dignity, too. Jonathan's brother, Marcus, a hedge fund shark with the same cruel smile, leaned across the table. "Well, Amelia," he drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear, "guess you won't be shopping on Rodeo Drive this Christmas." His wife, a woman who looked like she was perpetually smelling something unpleasant, tittered into her napkin. "More like the clearance rack at Target." A wave of laughter rippled around the table. It wasn't just a joke, it was a declaration. I was out. I was nothing. They were the insiders, the winners, and my humiliation was their after-dinner entertainment. I looked at Jonathan, hoping for a flicker of decency, a hint of the man I thought I had married. He just winked, a gesture of such profound dismissal it stole the air from my lungs. He raised his glass to me. "To Amelia," he said, the smile never leaving his face. "May she find whatever it is she's looking for." The toast was a final twist of the knife. I sat there, my hands trembling in my lap, the scent of roasted turkey and smug satisfaction thick in the air. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. A strange, cold clarity settled over me. They thought this was the end of my story. They had no idea I was about to start writing a new one. I took a slow sip of ice water, the cold a welcome shock to my system. My eyes met Eleanor's from across the table. She gave me a look of pity so condescending it was worse than the insults. It was the look you give an animal you've just run over. In that moment, staring at the matriarch of this gilded cage, I made a silent vow. They were laughing now, but I would make sure, by next Thanksgiving, that I would be the only one left with a reason to smile. The drive back to my apartment in Flatbush felt like crossing into another dimension. The opulent, manicured lawns of Greenwich, with their colonial mansions and silent, old-money judgment, gave way to the vibrant, chaotic pulse of Brooklyn. My building was a pre-war walk-up with faulty heating and neighbors who argued in languages I didn't understand. It was a world away from the Sterling sprawling estate, and the contrast was a physical blow. I dropped my keys on the rickety IKEA console table and surveyed my new life. One room, a kitchenette tucked into an alcove, and a bathroom where the tiles were cracked. My possessions, the The few things Jonathan's lawyers hadn't successfully argued were family assets, were stacked in cardboard boxes. It was pathetic. I was pathetic. For the first 2 weeks, I barely left the apartment. I lived on coffee and the dregs of my pride. The laughter from that Thanksgiving dinner table played on a loop in my head, each cruel word a fresh wound. Clearance rack at Target. Marcus's voice. Whatever it is she's looking for. Jonathan's final dismissive toast. I had given up everything for him. When we met, I was a hungry young reporter at the Village Voice, chasing down stories about city council corruption. He was the handsome, charming heir to a real estate fortune, dipping his toes into local politics. He'd found my ambition thrilling, my independence a charming novelty. "You're a fighter, Amelia," he'd said. "I love that." But love, I learned, had conditions. Slowly, subtly, he'd sanded down my edges. My late nights on assignment became arguments. My passion for uncovering truth was reframed as a reckless disregard for our safety. "These people play dirty, Ames," he'd warn. "Think about my family's reputation. Think about our future." His future, he meant. When he decided to run for state assembly, he asked me to quit my job. "Just for a little while," he'd said, his hand on my cheek. "I need you by my side. You're my greatest asset." I became a political wife, a smiling prop in a Chanel suit, my journalistic instincts repurposed to vet his speeches and charm donors. My entire identity was absorbed into his until there was nothing left of the original Amelia. The divorce papers had been a complete blindside. He'd served me the day after he lost the election, his political ambitions temporarily thwarted. It seemed he no longer had use for his greatest asset. The legal battle was a brutal, swift execution. His family's lawyers, a team from a white shoe firm in Manhattan, produced document after document. Loans I'd supposedly co-signed, credit cards I'd never seen, investments that had mysteriously vanished. They painted a picture of me as a frivolous, spendthrift wife who had driven them into financial ruin, all while Jonathan had been funneling money into offshore accounts and shell corporations for years. I was left with nothing but the debts they'd assigned to my name. It was a masterclass in financial and emotional annihilation. That was the core of my despair. It wasn't just the affair with Tiffany, a woman 10 years my junior, whose only discernible skill was a formidable Instagram following. It was the calculated cruelty of the betrayal. The man I had loved and trusted had been meticulously planning my destruction, possibly for years. One rainy Tuesday, huddled under a blanket because the radiator was clanging but producing no heat, I hit my breaking point. I was staring at a final notice from a creditor when a rage, so pure and hot it felt like a fever, burned through the fog of my depression. I wasn't just sad anymore. I was furious. This couldn't be the end. The fighter Jonathan claimed to have loved was still in there, buried under years of compromise and erasure. I stormed over to a stack of boxes in the corner, the ones labeled office, and tore them open. Inside were my old notebooks, my reporter's pads filled with shorthand, my dog-eared copies of The Elements of Style and Joan Didion essays. My old life, my real life. My fingers traced the worn leather of a notebook from my very first internship. The muscle memory was still there, the instinct to observe, to question, to connect the dots. I had spent years using those skills to build Jonathan Sterling's world. Now I would use them to tear it all down. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and a pen. At the top of the page, I wrote the name Eleanor, then Jonathan. Marcus. I began to list every hypocrisy I had witnessed, every whispered conversation I'd overheard, every shady deal glossed over at the dinner table. The time Eleanor had a local zoning law changed to benefit one of their development projects. The way Marcus boasted about shorting a stock based on insider information Jonathan had given him. The secret payoffs to silence inconvenient people. For 10 years, I had been their confidant, their wallpaper, the person they spoke freely in front of because they never saw me as a person, only a possession. They had forgotten I was a journalist. They had forgotten I was a writer, and they had forgotten that a writer remembers everything. The pages began to fill up. It was all there, a decade of dirt, a dynasty built on secrets and lies. I didn't have the money for lawyers to fight them in court. The legal system was their playground. But I had the truth, and I knew how to tell a story. A plan began to form, a dangerous, terrifying, and utterly exhilarating idea. They had made me a character in their tragedy, the discarded wife. Fine. I would write myself a new role, the author of their downfall. The story wouldn't be nonfiction. That would be too easy for them to bury in litigation. It would be a novel, a thinly veiled, exquisitely detailed work of fiction that would be so close to the truth, the Sterlings would choke on every word. I looked at the title on the legal pad, The Gilded Cage. It was perfect. A cold smile, my first genuine smile in months, touched my lips. The hunt was on. The first few weeks were a blur of frantic energy. My tiny apartment transformed into a war room. I tacked Bristol boards to the peeling paint of the walls, creating character maps and timelines. The Sterling family, renamed the Prescott dynasty for my novel, came to life under my pen. Jonathan became Julian, the charismatic, hollow political scion. Eleanor became Matilda, the family's smiling, iron-willed matriarch. I poured every ounce of my pain and rage into the pages, but I was careful to temper it with the cold, hard facts I'd accumulated over a decade. I remembered my first rule of journalism: show, don't tell. I didn't write that the Prescotts were corrupt. I described a scene I had witnessed firsthand. Matilda on the phone with a state senator, her voice like honeyed poison, casually calling in a favor that would rezone a protected wetland for a new luxury condo development. I didn't write that Julian was a faithless narcissist. I wrote the dialogue from the night I found a hotel receipt in his coat pocket, how he'd looked me straight in the eye and told me I was being hysterical, convincing me with such sincerity that I had ended up apologizing to him. The writing was an exorcism. Each keystroke was a reclamation of my own narrative. I worked 18-hour days, fueled by cheap coffee and the burning desire for vindication. I sold my grandmother's pearls, the last piece of valuable jewelry Jonathan's lawyers hadn't clawed away, to pay my rent and buy myself a few more months of time. My world shrank to the four walls of my apartment and the sprawling, ugly universe of the Prescott family. I reread old emails, cross-referenced dates in my old calendars, and mined the memories I had tried so hard to suppress. The financial crimes were the hardest part to fictionalize. I spent weeks in the business section of the Brooklyn Public Library, teaching myself the intricacies of shell corporations and tax havens so I could accurately describe how the Prescott family patriarch, a character based on Jonathan's late father, had hidden his fortune. I wanted the details to be so precise that any forensic accountant reading the book would nod in recognition. After 3 months of obsessive work, I had a manuscript. It was raw, angry, and over 500 pages long. It was the truest thing I had ever written. Now came the impossible part, getting someone to read it. I had been out of the industry for a decade. My contacts were stale, my name forgotten. I bought a copy of the Writer's Market and started compiling a list of literary agents. I wrote a query letter, a single page that had to somehow sell a decade of my life. The rejections started trickling in almost immediately. Most were form letters, polite but dismissive. Thank you for your interest, but this project is not the right fit for our list at this time. A few were more personal and more painful. The market for political dramas is soft, one wrote. Too much of a legal risk, said another. Doubt began to creep in. Was I crazy? Had I just wasted my last dollar on a revenge fantasy that would never see the light of day? The Sterling family was safe in their Greenwich fortress, probably not even thinking of me, while I was in a dingy Brooklyn apartment, tilting at windmills. Just as my hope began to dwindle, I got an email. It was from a junior agent at a small boutique agency in the city. Her name was Sarah Chen. "Dear Ms. Vance," it began. Amelia Vance. I hadn't used my maiden name in 10 years. Seeing it in print was a jolt. "I read the first 50 pages of The Gilded Cage last night," the email continued. "I couldn't put it down. Can you come in for a meeting tomorrow?" My hands were shaking so hard I could barely type my reply. The agency, Chen and Associates, was located in a narrow building in the Flatiron district. The office was cluttered, chaotic, and humming with an energy that felt like coming home. Sarah Chen was younger than me, sharp-eyed and dressed in a leather jacket that probably cost more than my month's rent. She held my manuscript in her hands like it was a sacred text. "This is explosive, Amelia," she said, skipping the pleasantries. "It's brilliant. It's also literary dynamite. Half the publishers in New York won't touch it for fear of a lawsuit. The other half will kill for it for the exact same reason." We talked for 2 hours. I told her the whole story, the unvarnished truth. She listened intently, her expression shifting from sympathy to a kind of predatory glee. "They will come after you," she said, her voice sober. "With everything they have, you need to be ready for that." "I am," I said, and the conviction in my own voice surprised me. The years of being a Sterling had made me timid and accommodating. That person was gone. "Good," Sarah smiled, "because I think we're going to make a fortune." Sarah was a shark. Within a month, she had an auction going between 3 major publishing houses. The bidding was fierce, fueled by the rumor that the novel was a roman à clef about a powerful, unnamed East Coast family. We accepted an offer from a publisher known for their courage and their killer legal team. The advance was life-changing. It wasn't just money, it was freedom. It was validation. The day the first check cleared, I didn't go shopping. I went to a law office and paid a retainer to a shrewd, tough-as-nails media lawyer Sarah had recommended. Then I wrote a check to pay off the fraudulent debts Jonathan had saddled me with. Each signature on those checks felt like breaking a chain. The publishing process was a whirlwind of edits, copy edits, and cover designs. My editor, a man named David, was brilliant. He helped me sharpen the narrative, deepen the characters, and make the story even more compelling without sacrificing the core truths. He was also the one who called me on a sunny Tuesday afternoon in May. "We have a problem," he said, his voice grim. "We received a letter today from the Sterling's lawyers, a cease and desist." A chill went down my spine, but it was accompanied by a surge of adrenaline. "What does it say?" I asked, my voice steady. "It says the book is a malicious and defamatory portrayal of their client," David read. "It demands we halt publication immediately and destroy all copies of the manuscript, or they will pursue damages to the full extent of the law. They claim to have proof you stole proprietary family information during your marriage." The lie was so audacious I almost laughed. They were accusing me of theft. The war had begun. The cease and desist letter was just the opening salvo. The Sterling's legal strategy was classic Goliath: overwhelm and intimidate. They filed a motion for discovery, demanding to see every draft of my manuscript, every note, every email I had ever sent that mentioned their family. It was a fishing expedition designed to bleed me dry, to bury me in legal fees and procedural nightmares until I gave up. But they made a crucial miscalculation. They assumed I was the same woman they had cast out a few months prior. They didn't know I now had a publisher with a vested financial interest in the book's success and a legal team that specialized in First Amendment battles. My lawyer, a woman named Rebecca Shaw, who had the serene calm of a predator, was unfazed. "It's a scare tactic, Amelia," she told me over the phone. "They have no case. The book is fiction. The characters are named Prescott, not Sterling. The burden of proof is on them to show that you've written with malicious intent and that what you've written is provably false. Truth is an absolute defense." Still, the process was grueling. I spent days in depositions, facing off against a team of sneering corporate lawyers who drilled me about my marriage, my finances, my motives. They tried to paint me as a bitter, vengeful ex-wife, a gold digger who was trying to extort money from a good family. I sat there under the fluorescent lights of a soulless conference room and answered every question with the cold, hard truth. I told them about the journalism career I'd abandoned. I told them about the financial manipulations, presenting the evidence I had meticulously gathered. I never raised my voice. I never cried. I simply stated the facts. The Sterling family, I realized, was so accustomed to buying silence that they didn't know how to handle someone who refused to be intimidated. While the legal battle raged behind the scenes, something else was happening. The lawsuit, meant to silence me, had the opposite effect. It created a buzz. Whispers started in the publishing world, then spread to literary blogs. What was in this book that had one of Connecticut's most powerful families so terrified? Sarah, my agent, was a master at fanning the flames. Without ever confirming the connection, she allowed the intrigue to build. The publisher, sensing a phenomenon, moved up the release date. The legal threats only grew more intense. One evening, I received a personal call. The number was blocked, but I knew the voice instantly. It was Eleanor Sterling. Her tone was no longer condescendingly sweet. It was as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. "You have no idea what you're doing, you foolish little girl," she hissed. "There are things you don't know. Reputations are delicate things. You are playing with fire that will consume you." "It's a work of fiction, Eleanor," I said calmly, my heart hammering against my ribs. "If you see yourself in the character of a corrupt, manipulative monster, perhaps that's something you should discuss with your therapist, not my publisher." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a click. She had hung up. That was the moment I knew I had truly won. She was scared. The matriarch who ruled her family and a slice of New England society with an iron fist was genuinely, deeply afraid of a book. The day The Gilded Cage was released, I walked to the Barnes & Noble in Union Square, and there it was. A huge stack of them right by the entrance, my name on the cover in bold, elegant letters. Amelia Vance. I ran my fingers over the glossy jacket. It was real. I had done it. The initial sales were strong, driven by the pre-publication hype. The first review came from the New York Times. "A blistering, brilliant debut," the reviewer called it. "A chilling portrait of greed and moral decay among the East Coast elite." While billed as fiction, one gets the distinct impression that author Amelia Vance knows of what she speaks. It's a revenge novel, to be sure, but it is also a masterclass in storytelling. The book exploded. It hit the bestseller list at number 3 in the first week. By the third week, it was number 1. My face was on morning talk shows. I was profiled in magazines. Everyone was talking about The Gilded Cage, and everyone was speculating about the real-life family that had inspired it. Journalists, far more tenacious than the Sterling's lawyers, started digging. They connected the dots. An article in Vanity Fair laid out the parallels between the fictional Prescott family's business dealings and several of the Sterling's more controversial real estate ventures. Jonathan's political career, which he had been trying to revive, was instantly over. Donors pulled their funding. The party disavowed him. He became a pariah overnight. The social fallout for the family was just as devastating. Friends they had known for decades suddenly grew distant. Invitations to charity galas and society events dried up. The Sterling name, once a symbol of power and respectability, was now synonymous with the corruption and cruelty I had detailed in my novel. I saw a picture of Eleanor in a gossip magazine, leaving a restaurant on the Upper East Side. She looked haggard, a world away from the perfectly coiffed Queen of Greenwich. The headline read, "Sterling Matriarch Caged by Bestseller Scandal." I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I just felt a quiet, profound sense of justice. They hadn't just been brought down by a book. They had been brought down by their own actions. I had simply turned on the lights. Then, in early November, an invitation arrived. It was printed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock, the Sterling family crest embossed in gold at the top. It was for Thanksgiving dinner. My first instinct was to throw it away. Why would I ever subject myself to that again? But then I looked at the bestseller list on my laptop, my book still sitting at number 1. I thought about the woman who had sat at that table a year ago, shattered and silent. And I knew I had to go. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about closing a chapter. I RSVP'd with a simple yes. This year I wouldn't be coming as a victim. I would be coming as the author of their fate. The drive to Greenwich this time was different. I wasn't in a 10-year-old sedan, feeling like a poor relation on a pilgrimage. I was in a brand new Audi that the movie studio had sent for me, the same studio that had just paid 7 figures for the film rights to The Gilded Cage. The autumn leaves seemed brighter, the air crisper. Or maybe it was just me. I had instructed the driver to pull up at exactly 2 o'clock. As I walked up the long slate pathway to the front door, I could feel the weight of the past year. It had been a lifetime. I had walked into my Brooklyn apartment a ghost, and I was walking out of it a woman I barely recognized but was immensely proud of. I rang the bell. The door was opened by a housekeeper I didn't recognize. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a flicker of recognition. "Miss Vance," she murmured, and led me inside. The house was silent, not the comfortable silence of a home, but the tense, heavy silence of a tomb. The scent of turkey was in the air, but it was undercut by something else, the smell of defeat. I walked into the grand drawing room, where the family always gathered for pre-dinner cocktails. They were all there. Eleanor, Jonathan, his brother Marcus and his wife, and Tiffany, the fiancée, who looked pale and anxious, the massive diamond on her finger suddenly looking less like a trophy and more like a handcuff. They all stared at me as I entered. It was as if I had walked through a wall. I was wearing a simple but elegant black dress from a designer whose name they would all recognize. My hair and makeup were professionally done, a small indulgence for the occasion. I wanted them to see that I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. "Amelia," Eleanor said, her voice brittle. She was holding a glass of sherry, her knuckles white. "How good of you to come." "You invited me, or?" I replied, my voice calm and even. I walked over to the bar and poured myself a glass of sparkling water. Jonathan wouldn't meet my eye. He just stared into the fireplace, his handsome face looking gaunt and tired. The charisma that had once charmed rooms and won votes was gone, replaced by a sullen, bitter resentment. Marcus, who had made the joke about Target, looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. This was my fault, all of it. In his mind, I was the villain. Tiffany cleared her throat. "That's a lovely dress, Amelia," she said, her voice a high-pitched squeak. It was a desperate attempt at normalcy in a room thick with unspoken rage. "Thank you, Tiffany," I said, turning to give her a small, genuine smile. She wasn't the enemy. She was just a casualty, another woman who had been dazzled by the sterling facade and was now trapped inside the crumbling edifice. The silence stretched on, excruciating. It was a standoff. They were waiting for me to say something, to gloat, to rub their faces in my success. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. I had already said everything I needed to say in 500 pages. Finally, the housekeeper announced that dinner was served. We filed into the formal dining room, the same room where my public execution had taken place a year ago. The table was set with the same bone china, the same family silver. But the atmosphere was utterly transformed. Last year, the room had buzzed with their power and confidence. Now, it was suffocating with their shame. I took my seat, and then I reached into my bag and pulled out a book. It was a special, leather-bound first edition of The Gilded Cage. I had had it made specifically for this occasion. I placed it on the table next to my plate, the gold leaf title glinting in the candlelight. "I wasn't sure what to bring," I said to the silent table, "so I brought this." Every eye was fixed on the book. It sat there like a bomb. It was the physical manifestation of all their secrets, the instrument of their destruction. Eleanor stared at it, her face a mask of controlled fury. Jonathan finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a helpless, pathetic rage. The dinner was a surreal ordeal. No one spoke. The only sounds were the clinking of silverware against china and the frantic, silent chewing. Every bite seemed to stick in their throats. They were trapped at their own table, forced to confront the woman they had tried to destroy and the evidence of their own moral bankruptcy. I ate my dinner calmly, taking my time. I was no longer the frightened, humiliated woman from last year. I was a guest in a museum of my own making, observing the relics of a fallen empire. I had taken their power, not by being louder or crueler, but by telling the truth. Their laughter had been a weapon meant to crush me, but instead it had been the catalyst for my rebirth. As the disastrous meal concluded, they all but fled the dining room. I remained seated for a moment, looking at the long, polished table, at the monument to their arrogance. It was over. As I was putting on my coat in the grand foyer, getting ready to leave the suffocating silence of the Sterling mansion behind me forever, Eleanor appeared at my side. She moved without a sound, a ghost in her own home. The other family members had scattered, retreating to whatever corners of the house they could find to lick their wounds in private. Jonathan had disappeared upstairs without a word, Tiffany trailing uncertainly behind him. Marcus and his wife had muttered a hasty goodbye and practically sprinted out the door. Only Eleanor remained, the last soldier on a lost battlefield. She wasn't looking at me, but at the leather-bound copy of The Gilded Cage, which I held in my hand. Her face, in the dim light of the foyer, was a ruin. The carefully constructed mask of civility and power had crumbled, revealing the bitter, frightened woman beneath. "All of this," she said, her voice a low, venomous whisper. Her gesture encompassed the house, the family, the name she had spent her life cultivating. "Everything my husband built, everything I protected, you burned it all to the ground." I turned to face her fully. I saw no reason for pretense, not anymore. "I didn't burn anything, Eleanor. It was already rotten from the inside. I just opened a window and let the public see the decay." Her eyes, cold and dark, finally met mine. "For what? For money? For fame? Was it worth it, Amelia? Was your petty revenge worth destroying a family?" I thought about her question for a long moment. I thought about the year I had just lived, the despair of my tiny Brooklyn apartment, the fear of the legal threats, the grueling hours spent writing, the sheer terror of putting my truth into the world. And then I thought about the freedom I now had, the ability to walk into any room and not feel small, the knowledge that I had fought back against an insurmountable force and won on my own terms. I looked past Eleanor, through the archway into the drawing room, where a large framed photograph sat on the mantelpiece. It was of my son, Jack, when he was 7 years old, taken on a family vacation. Jonathan's lawyers had argued successfully that it was a family heirloom, and I'd been forced to leave it behind. He was spending this Thanksgiving with his father, a pawn in their cruel games. My book hadn't just been for me, it had been for him. It was to ensure that he would one day know the truth, and that he would have a chance to escape the toxic legacy of the Sterling name. The fortune I'd earned would give him choices they could never control. "You call it revenge," I said, my voice quiet but clear in the silent hall. "I call it a rescue mission." Eleanor recoiled as if I'd struck her. She had no reply. There was nothing left to say. The truth was, the one thing her money and influence couldn't change. I opened the heavy oak door and stepped out into the cold November night. The air was clean and sharp, and for the first time, it felt like I could finally breathe it in. The driver was waiting for me, the engine humming softly. As I got into the car, I took one last look back at the grand, imposing house. The lights seemed dimmer now, the windows like vacant eyes. It was no longer a symbol of power and wealth to me. It was just a house, a gilded cage, now empty of its luster. My phone buzzed in my purse. It was a text from my agent, Sarah. It was a picture of the New York Times book review section for the upcoming Sunday edition. There was a feature article, a glowing profile of me, the author who had taken the literary world by storm. The headline was simple, The Storyteller. I settled back against the leather seat as the car pulled away, leaving the Sterling mansion and the ghosts within it behind. I had walked in there a year ago as a footnote in their story. I left as the author of my own. The weeks following that final silent Thanksgiving were a whirlwind of new beginnings. The movie based on The Gilded Cage went into pre-production, and I was brought on as a consultant and executive producer. I found myself in meetings in Los Angeles, sitting across from A-list actresses who were vying to play the character based on me, discussing script points with an Oscar-winning screenwriter. It was a surreal existence, a universe away from the life I had known. I bought a brownstone in Park Slope, a beautiful old house, with a small garden in the back. It was the first home that was truly mine, paid for with my own money, filled with my own things. I set up a writing studio on the top floor, a room filled with light and books overlooking the trees. It was my sanctuary. I occasionally heard news of the Sterlings, filtered through gossip columns or snippets from mutual acquaintances. Their fall from grace was as complete as it was public. Marcus's hedge fund was under federal investigation for the insider trading I had alluded to in the book. Jonathan, politically and socially toxic, had moved with Tiffany to a condo in Florida, financed by what little money his mother had managed to shield. Their engagement was reportedly on shaky ground. Eleanor remained in the Greenwich mansion, a queen presiding over an empire of ghosts. The house was a monument to her failure, a place people pointed at on architectural tours as the house from the Gilded Cage. My primary concern, however, was my son Jack. The custody battle was ugly, but this time I had the resources to fight back. The public fallout from the book had given me an advantage. My legal team compiled a mountain of evidence detailing the toxic environment of the Sterling home. In the end, the judge awarded me primary custody. Jack came to live with me in Brooklyn. He was quiet at first, conditioned by years of his father's and grandmother's influence. But slowly, in the warmth and stability of our new home, he began to thrive. He was free from the pressure of being a Sterling. He could just be a kid. He and I were building a new life, a real one, far from the gilded cage he'd been born into. We were creating our own traditions, our own stories. One evening, about a year after the book was published, I was tucking Jack into bed. He was 13 now, on the cusp of becoming a young man. We had just finished reading a chapter of a book together, a ritual we had started. "Mom," he said, his voice sleepy. "Yeah, honey?" "That book you wrote, were you scared to publish it?" I paused, considering his question. "Terrified," I admitted. "Then why'd you do it?" I smoothed the hair back from his forehead and looked into his eyes that were so much like his father's, but without the coldness. I wanted him to understand, not just now, but years from now. "Because some stories need to be told," I said softly. "Not just for the person telling them, but for the people who need to hear them. I wanted you to know that the truth is always more powerful than lies, even when it's quiet, and even when you're scared, and I never, ever wanted you to feel like you had to be silent." He seemed to understand. He nodded, closed his eyes, and was asleep within minutes. I stood in the doorway of his room, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest. He was safe. He was free. That was the ultimate victory. That was the happy ending the book couldn't provide, the one I had to build for myself, brick by brick. My phone buzzed again, this time an email from David, my editor. "They love the new pages," it read. "Contract for book 2 is on its way." I smiled. The story wasn't over. It was just getting started. I walked to my office and sat down at my desk, the lights of Brooklyn twinkling outside my window. I looked at the blank screen, the cursor blinking patiently, waiting for the first word. They thought they had erased me, but they had only given me something to write about. They had no idea that a woman with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous and the most powerful storyteller of all. I took a deep breath, placed my fingers on the keyboard, and began to type. My revenge wasn't a single act, a dish served cold on one Thanksgiving evening. It was my entire life, lived well and freely, a story I would continue to write on my own terms, page by page, chapter by chapter, for the rest of my days. The quietest victories are often the most complete. The end.